Would you remain silent if a fallen hero was disrespected? Or would you stand up to defend his honor? On one unforgettable flight, Barron Trump made a choice that left everyone speechless. Boarding for Flight 729 bound for Washington, D.C. was already underway. Passengers were walking down the aisle, stowing their bags and adjusting their seats. Amid the usual pre-flight hubbub, the flight crew paused. Outside, a black horse approached the plane. On the tarmac, an honor guard unfurled an American flag and placed it over a casket. Inside the plane, a momentary silence fell as some passengers realized what was happening. A crew member quietly explained over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be experiencing a brief delay as we honor a fallen soldier who is being transported to his final resting place in Washington, D.C." The solemnity of the moment was not understood by everyone. A man in a dress shirt complained, "This is ridiculous. We have a schedule to keep." A young woman next to him added, "Why couldn't they do that after we took off? Some of us have places to go." Their voices cut through the silence like a knife, causing discomfort among the other passengers. Murmurs of disapproval began to spread. The honor guards, attentive and respectful, carried the coffin up the loading ramp. Inside the cabin, the tension was rising. No one imagined that a young man in the last row was about to completely change the narrative. The interior of the plane was unusually tense. Luggage was stowed and seat belts were fastened as passengers tried to keep the process moving. Outside, honor guards arrived at the plane's door, carefully carrying the flag-draped casket. Sitting in the middle of the cabin, the man in the dress shirt let out a dramatic sigh. "This is going to take forever," he muttered, loud enough for everyone around to hear. Their impatience seemed to rub off on others. A woman two rows back complained, "What's so special? It's not like the soldier knows we're waiting." A wave of uncomfortable reactions spread through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some looking at their phones, as if to escape the moment. An elderly woman near the window opened her eyes with a handkerchief, murmuring softly to the man next to her, "That could have been my grandfather." In the last row, a tall young man named Barron watched intently. Dressed simply in a dark jacket, he stood out discreetly. Barron wasn't with the main group of passengers. He'd slipped in with a security detail, sitting in the last row. He wasn't looking at his phone or fiddling with his things like so many of the others. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the window, where the honor guards were carrying out their work with the solemnity and care it deserved. The murmurs of impatience grew louder, and Barron knew that this moment called for more than silence. A man sitting a little way up the flight stood up to speak to a flight attendant. "Look, I'm sorry, but I have a connection to make. How much longer is this going to take?" His tone was impatient and unapologetic. The professional flight attendant responded kindly, "Sir, this process should only take a few more minutes. We appreciate your patience as we honor a fallen service member." His words seemed to have no effect. The man walked away and sat back down, muttering under his breath. A few passengers around him moved away, exchanging knowing glances, as if the delay were a personal affront. The woman who had complained earlier spoke again, her voice somber. "This is why airlines are such a mess. They cling to these superior gestures instead of focusing on schedules." It was as if the act of disrespect fed on itself, aging those who shared the sentiment. The cabin, once quiet, now vibrated with quiet discontent. A veteran sitting near the front of the plane stood up but remained silent. The elderly woman by the window lowered her head, gently tapping her forehead. The veteran continued to watch. He glanced at the security detail sitting a few rows ahead. They seemed neutral, their faces expressionless, but the veteran's expression changed. His gaze shifted from the passengers, mirroring the movements of the honor guard at the window next to him. As the last murmur of disrespect echoed through the cabin, the veteran made a decision that would completely change the atmosphere. The plane was about to take off, the murmurs of disrespect still echoing. But at the back of the plane, young Barron stood up, his imposing presence casting a shadow over the row in front of him. His presence, barely visible until then, began to change. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate but calm. The height of his 6-foot-tall frame caught the attention of a nearby passenger, who turned to look. Recognition spread quickly. The words, "Is that Barron Trump?" echoed through the cabin, mingling with discontent. Barron stood up slowly, just enough to cut through the noise. His voice, steady and assured, carried a weight that immediately drew attention. "Excuse me," he began, his tone calm but authoritative. "I'd like to say something." The murmurs died almost immediately. Heads turned, and the passengers who had been vocal in their disdain shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the man in the dress shirt, who had been the most vocal, looked down, his expression sheepish. "I understand everyone is in a hurry," Barron continued, his hands resting on the back of the seat in front of him. "But that coffin down there belongs to someone who made the ultimate sacrifice for this country. Someone who gave his time, his future, his life, so that the rest of us could enjoy the freedoms we have." His words echoed in the air, each syllable precise, each pause intentional. The plane was completely silent except for the sound of the engines. But Barron wasn't finished. He had more to say, something that would leave an indelible mark on everyone present. Barron's gaze swept around the cabin, meeting the eyes of the passengers one by one. "You don't need to know their names or their stories," he said, his voice firm but thick with emotion. "What matters is the respect they deserve, not just for their sacrifice, but for the countless sacrifices made by so many others like them." His words carried a weight that silenced even the most impatient passengers. The man in the dress shirt shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to look Barron in the eye. The young woman who had spoken earlier looked down at her hands, avoiding the gazes of everyone around her. Barron continued, his voice suffering but without losing any of his conviction. "I think we can all take a few moments to say goodbye to someone who can no longer speak for themselves. They gave so much more than any of us can in these few moments of waiting." The flight attendants exchanged glances, clearly moved. Even the veteran near the front of the plane, who had remained silent until then, shifted in his seat, his expression pained. And then, in an unexpected gesture, Barron did something no one had anticipated. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a small American flag. Holding it carefully, he walked to the middle of the cabin and placed it on the empty seat closest to the window, directly above where the casket rested below. "That seat belongs to them," he said simply, returning to his seat. His words carried an almost sacred finality, and the simplicity of the act spoke louder than anything. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. Barron, or anyone else, could have predicted it. The plane seemed to hold its breath. Barron's gesture reverberated through the cabin, leaving room for more complaints. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The flag resting on the empty seat became a poignant symbol, visible to everyone and impossible to ignore. The veteran near the front stopped. His movement was slow but purposeful. "My son," he said. His voice was hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for reminding us of what's important." He gave Barron a respectful nod before placing his hand over his heart. Others began to follow, standing or sitting up straighter, their hands mimicking the veteran's gesture. The man in the dress shirt, who had been so vocal earlier, looked around at the sea of solemn faces. His bravado seemed to fade under the weight of the moment. I didn't mean to be disrespectful," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The young woman beside him blushed. Her earlier indifference was replaced by visible guilt. But it wasn't just embarrassment that filled the plane. Something deeper was going on. A teenager in a t-shirt, who had been watching silently from a window seat, took off his glasses and murmured, That's cool." His voice was full of respect. A mother whispered something to her son, who looked at Barron with wide, curious eyes. The flight crew, touched by the unfolding scene, moved with reverence as they finalized preparations for takeoff. A flight attendant approached Barron, her voice cracking as she said, "Thank you for doing this. It means more than you know." But as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, another wave of emotion swept over the passengers, cementing this moment in their hearts forever. As the plane taxied onto the runway, a hushed reverence filled the cabin. The passengers sat in reflective silence, their earlier impatience replaced by quiet introspection. Outside the window, the honor guards saluted as the plane began to move, their figures standing out against the setting sun. Midway through the flight, the pilot announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for your patience earlier. We are transporting the remains of a fallen soldier today, and it is a solemn honor to have them on board. Let us take a moment of silence to reflect and pay our respects. The entire plane complied without hesitation. Seatbelts fastened, hands clasped, eyes closed. It was as if everyone on board felt the weight of the moment in their own way. The man in the dress shirt, who had previously hidden his impatience, clasped his hands together, his expression grim. The young woman who had joined the complainants wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Barron remained in his seat, his focus unwavering. He sought no recognition or thanks. His goal had always been simple: to remind everyone of the value of respect and sacrifice. His security detail exchanged a subtle glance, acknowledging the young man's composure with quiet pride. When the plane landed in Washington, D.C., the passengers remained seated, as the crew had requested. No one rushed to disembark. Instead, they watched as the honor guards removed the casket, standing tall as they carried the coffin off the plane. A wave of applause began, soft at first, then building into something powerful and unified. Barron did not applaud. He placed his hand over his heart, a small but meaningful gesture that resonated deeply. But as passengers disembarked from the plane, many carried something much bigger than their luggage: a renewed sense of what it means to honor and remember. As passengers disembarked from the plane, the atmosphere was strangely different from that upon boarding. The earlier dissatisfactions and frustrations had disappeared, replaced by an air of quiet reflection. Some chatted with the cabin crew, others waved at Barron as they passed, their expressions full of gratitude and respect. The man in the dress shirt paused briefly near the exit. Turning to Barron, he hesitated and said, "You were right. I needed that reminder." Barron simply nodded, his face calm but firm. The young woman followed close behind, murmuring heartily, "Thank you." Outside the tarmac, honor guards carried the casket to a waiting hearse, while a small group of spectators watched. Among them were the family of the fallen soldier, their faces etched with grief but also with pride. Passengers, many of whom had been strangers to each other only hours before, stood at the airport windows, watching the scene unfold. In that moment, they were not just passengers, but witnesses to a collective remembrance of sacrifice and unity. As Barron left the terminal with his security detail, he looked back once, noting the people who stood shoulder to shoulder, moved by the power of one small act. This isn't just a story about a fallen soldier. It's a story about the importance of respect. Respect for those who give their all, and respect for the moments that demand our attention, no matter how inconvenient they may seem. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on the sacrifices of others. Let's carry on the lessons of humility and gratitude, one small gesture at a time. And don't forget to share this message. It's one the world needs to hear. Subscribe for more stories that inspire and remind us of what really matters.